Special thanks to Iconic Autos in Berkshire for lending me the car for this review. I've linked their website down below where you can check out this car, as well as all of their current stock, and of course all of their contact information is on there as well. If the timeline of my vehicle purchasing history had been just slightly different, then the opening of this review could have been very different itself. Instead of me borrowing this car from Iconic Autos and giving them a shout out for that, this could have been my car, as I have with other reviews in the past, because this Mercedes CL, not this exact one, but this car in general, was on my shortlist before I purchased the Maserati. And given the kind of cars that I buy and review and love, I feel that I'm in a pretty well qualified position to talk about the dangers of purchasing an affordable high-performance / luxury car. My previous history, for those who don't know, includes Touareg V10s and Maserati Quattroportes, so yeah, I kind of like high-risk, low-price vehicles. But that's not to say that I haven't been bitten, especially with the Maserati in particular. So what are my thoughts on this Mercedes? Is it worth looking into, at least? Because of course the final choice has to be yours. Well, what I can tell you is that this is one of those occasions where people often say you shouldn't meet your heroes. I've liked the CL for a long time. I wasn't nervous driving it, but I was very curious to see how its size and weight, and let's be honest, slight lack of power even compared to the 55 or 65 AMG versions would actually feel in practice. Because it's one thing to look at the specs on paper, it's a very different thing to feel how a car actually performs in action. And what I can confirm is the car may not be as impressive as the full red-blooded AMGs, but it ain't slow, that's for sure, and it certainly is not underpowered. Now, the engine in this one specifically is a naturally aspirated, which in itself is pretty interesting for the time. Most of the AMGs are twin-turbo, for instance the 55 and 65, and yes, they are more powerful. The CL55 has about 500 horsepower, the CL65 about 600. Good luck finding one of those though, especially for less than double the price of this, sometimes even 3 times the price. That is what makes this one good. The price, because the price on a CL600 is not that much more than a CL500, but instead of a 5-litre V8, you get, as I said, a naturally aspirated 5.8-litre V12. It's got 360 horsepower, or just over technically, just under 400 pound-feet of torque. Of course it's an automatic with rear-wheel drive, and it is a 2+2 GT. Essentially the CL is a 2-door Mercedes S-Class. And that's not exactly a bad thing, given that it's of course not designed to be the most chuckable car through corners. It's a big, luxurious continent crusher, and it's a fantastic rival even to cars that came out a couple of years later, like the Bentley Continental GT, certainly any Jag or Aston at the time. So has it aged as well, or aged worse, than some of its contemporaries and rivals? Well, in my opinion, it's aged very well, at least in some ways. Now, the ways in which this car hasn't aged quite as well, I believe, are far more subjective and therefore not quite as important. So let's get those out of the way first. Stuff like the CD, or in this case cassette, in the center console, the fact that the design won't be for everyone, it does look its age for sure, and just the general aesthetic is very late 90s, early 2000s. The reason why I said that that isn't as important is because everything I just said is purely subjective. If you like the way it looks, if you like the interior, if you don't care that it has a cassette player, none of that will matter to you, and that's great. Because now we can get to the important stuff. The way it performs, the way it handles, and the way it feels. The handling, first of all, is shockingly good. Now, the steering wheel on this car is massive. It's a work of art in its own right. I love the way the wood feels. Even just touching the wheel before you even turn it in anger, you can feel the quality that the car has. Everything about the vehicle, from the clunk of the door handle to the way the massive oar-sized door swings open, to the thick seats, the huge steering wheel, everything about the car feels chunky. It's got this feeling of just sheer weight and quality to it, and weight it certainly has, because don't be fooled by the 2 doors, it's a very big, very heavy car. The weight on the lowest end of the spectrum for this generation was still 1.9 tons, and it goes all the way up to 2,155 kilos, which is technically a 2.2 ton car. That's huge. It's not quite Bentley, but it's very, very heavy, especially given that the car doesn't even have all-wheel drive, adding to that weight. Now, the engine, as I said, is a 360 horsepower, 400 pound-feet unit. It doesn't really like to rev that high, but it also doesn't need to, because the way I would describe this car's engine is like a Rolls-Royce. That's the exact kind of V12 you're getting here. It's not the kind of car that you should ever purchase if you're looking to strip it out and take it around a track, because no matter how much weight you strip out of a vehicle like this, it's never going to want to do that. This is the kind of vehicle that you purchase for a good price, you use it every day if you want to, as long as you can afford the fuel of course, and you use it to crush continents. That's the whole point. If you want the rabid side of things, well, that's when something like a CL55 AMG comes in, because it's a similar price for a used one, but you get a lot more power, a V8 instead of a V12, the additional body kit, etc. It's the more overtly performance model. And to put my cards on the table, I have no doubt that I would adore that car if it were in this review. But that's not to say that I didn't like this one, because this definitely appeals to me as well. I might be a slightly younger guy, and most younger guys don't tend to buy and love the kind of cars that I do, Touaregs, Quattroportes, Mercedes CLs, but I love this kind of thing. Big, lazy, effortless power, supreme comfort, and plenty of space. Now, speaking of the space, that might be one of the things that you need to know if you are looking to buy one. As a driver, how much space is there? If you are, for instance, like me, a taller guy, is it comfortable to ride in? Well, in two ways it is, one way not so much, because obviously there are three things to consider. The width for your elbows, the length for your legs, and the height for your head. Width, fantastic. Length, no problem. Headroom, not so much. And that really surprised me, because it looks like a car that would have all the headroom you could ever need, and in the back, the rear passengers, somewhat ironically, have way more space than a 2+2 usually would, because the wheelbase of the car is so long. So if, for instance, you're a small family, maybe you've got one or two younger kids, or even older kids, they're going to fit in the back no problem at all. There's tons of space. Likewise with the trunk, or the boot as we call it here in the UK, you can get a lot of stuff in the back of this car, far more than most GTs can. So in terms of sheer space, it's a very practical car. In fact, far more practical and spacious than any coupe would really have any right to be, and it's because of that sheer size. In the driver's seat though, as I said, the headroom is not as ideal. Now, it's not uncomfortable by any stretch, it's just that because the seat is so thickly packed and comfortable, you can't lower it quite as much. So instead you have to kind of tilt the back of the seat back a little bit more, which is why in some of the shots in this video, it looks like I'm kind of sitting like a lowrider. I don't like to sit that way, I prefer to be more upright, but that's the way I had to be to fit in the car properly. If you're under 6 feet, you'll be fine. I mean, absolutely fine in this car. If you're over 6 feet, you might want to reconsider and perhaps purchase something else. To go back to the car's driving and performance on the other hand though, the handling really is the thing that shocked me the most in terms of how good it is. This car has no right to handle and perform as well as it does. Because again, let's be honest, this was a 6-figure car when it was new, £100,000 with the car specced up. That's about 12 grand more than a Porsche 911 Turbo at the time. That is a huge amount of money for something like this that doesn't even have any overt AMG badges on it, which of course you'd expect a higher price from. Now, speaking of that tech, it was very advanced for the time. Not just the engine, it has radar cruise control, cooling seats as well as heated seats, and of course this isn't guaranteed on all models, so make sure that the car that you're looking at, for instance, does have those things if you want them. But the point is, the car has a lot to love, but also a lot to go wrong. And of course that is the calculated risk. Now, in my experience, I've had cars that are a little bit hit and miss. With the Touareg, I've had some electrical issues, but never any engine issues, and with the Maserati, it was the total opposite. And of course, in a review like this, where I was road testing it for a few hours, I can't tell you what the long-term reliability is like because I simply don't own the car. So if you are, for instance, a previous owner or a current owner of this generation, not necessarily just a 600, but a CL in general, feel free to put your thoughts and experiences down below, because if other potential buyers watch this review, that could be very helpful for them to know what kind of costs to expect. Now, of course, if the V12 breaks, it's going to cost you a lot. other things potentially won't be as much. My Touareg again, for instance, the V10 is very expensive to work on, everything else actually isn't that bad. Likewise with the Mercedes, it wouldn't surprise me if you could source some of your own parts for much lower prices than, for instance, a Mercedes dealer or a specialist would charge. And of course that's your choice to make whether you want to do that. As far as the one running cost that I can guarantee you'll need though, that is the fuel, because at best you're looking at just over 20 to the gallon. So again, right on par with the Maserati, and interestingly, speaking of the performance comparison, you might not think of this car as being quite that quick, because again, it's not an AMG technically, so is it really designed for that? Well actually, it's quicker than you might think. 5.8 seconds to 60 is not bad at all. For a car that weighs over 2 tons and has no turbos, no superchargers, and isn't really even designed for sheer brute performance, the car doesn't really accelerate, it more just wafts forward. It just goes. It feels like you're floating down the road. The suspension is magnificent on this car, and to be honest, that is the single word that I would use to describe my entire experience with the vehicle. Magnificent. It's exactly what the car feels like. The presence that it has, the sheer size and scope of the car on the road, the way it sits, the way it handles its weight through corners, the way it slows down, the way it accelerates, even the way it sounds, with the almost total lack of sound from the V12, which of course, we all like a nice noise, but again, the car isn't designed for that. You could put a straight pipe on it, for instance, and make it sound better, but in its natural form, this is not a car that was ever designed or intended to be thrashed. It's the kind of car for somebody who would typically buy or have a Rolls-Royce in their collection, who maybe wants something that's just a little bit more sporty. This is not a Nürburgring crushing monster. It's a motorway crushing monster. You can drive this thing for hours, never feel uncomfortable, never have any annoyances of any kind. As I said, it just wafts you down the road and gets you where you need to go, but with surprisingly good handling, a great amount of space for the most part, and a decent amount of practicality. The trunk space is good, the fuel economy, that depends on you and your budget of course. The insurance actually isn't as crazy as you'd think either, especially for a slightly younger driver, because young people don't tend to buy cars like this. So my ultimate final thoughts on the CL600 of this generation are that if you are in the market, or if you're at the very least considering a CL, maybe a 600, maybe something else, try at all costs to arrange a test drive. Even if you're not driving the car, even if you have to be the passenger, just make it happen. Because if you like the car from afar, I can guarantee you will like it when you drive it. The handling, the suspension, the way it delivers its performance, the incredible smoothness of the engine, which you really do have to experience for yourself, it won't disappoint you in any way. The only way in which this car could ever disappoint you is if it breaks, and that's kind of the consistent thing with all of the cars that I love. So of course, as I always say, with a vehicle like this, it's a calculated risk. You just have to decide if the risk is worth it to you. But that's it for this installment. Thanks once again to Iconic Autos, and this is not the last time I'm going to be working with them, so stick around on the channel for more, and if you want to see more of my car reviews for both brand new and used performance cars, click here on screen or click the playlist right below this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.